Hello and welcome to Game Changing with me, Tim Thornton.
And me, Chris Sheldon.
In this podcast, we chat to various luminaries from the music world who we've met along the way.
About those key moments in their careers where the stars aligned and it all started to go right. It's one thing for a record producer to get the breaks they need, but having the talent, ears and character to stay firmly in the zone is another thing entirely. Tim Palmer has managed to remain at the top of his game for some 35 years, working with a dizzying range of names, from The Mission to Robert Plant, from Pearl Jam to Tears for Fears, plus that famously left field and perhaps controversial David Bowie project, Tin Machine. Through all this, he's remained very much the affable boy from Surrey, whom I first met when we went to school together, and later collaborated with on various projects. We sat down with Tim earlier this year to pick his brains about how it all happened.
Fairly early on, and I worked with Mark Knopfler. Well, we worked on the soundtrack to the movie Local Hero.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And there was one particular song that we cut, and
That was the main
it was like the main theme to the
I remember
movie.
how it went.
I found out recently, through my ties back to Newcastle, that they play that song every time Newcastle United play as their theme song at not Roker Park, at St James's Park. And they still play it every time.
That's so funny.
I know, it is. I had no idea.
That was one of your first assisting gigs for a big artist, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, it was as you know, as well as I do. Those days there wasn't the recording school route into learning how to do this, and you were basically an apprentice, weren't you? My father worked in television. And one day he said to me, there's a record producer that I met the other day. You might want to meet him. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, he's produced Shawaddy Waddy, which didn't exactly set me on fire. But I said, no, you should meet people like that because I know you love music and you're not, obviously I hadn't got a job at this point. So I went and met Phil, and it turned out Phil Wayman was way more than just Shawaddy producer.
Yeah,
he was a legendary music producer who'd worked with The Sweet and Mud and the Boomtown Rats, and he had a studio, and he took me to see his studio, which of course I fell in love with because I'd been in bands at school, Chris had been in bands, and we'd done demos in tiny little 8 tracks, but this was a proper 24-track studio. So after the tour I said to him, how do you get a job in a place like this? And he said, well, we need people to clean up and make tea, so I can put your name on the waiting list if you're interested. So I said I would love to do that, and I never really heard from him for quite a while.
Yeah.
But then about 6 months later, somebody from the studio called up and said, is Tim still interested in, starting, cleaning up, and I was straight in. Yeah. It was just amazing. It was an amazing opportunity, and it's something that a lot of, as we said, being an apprentice to all these great engineers and working in a studio that was constantly being booked because of its name itself. People didn't bring in outside engineers at the beginning. They came to a studio because the studio, whether it's Abbey Road or Rack, they came to the studios for the engineers. So at our studio we had John Maxwith, who'd worked with the Dave Clark 5. We had James Guthrie, who'd done all the Floyd things, and Andy Jackson, who'd also worked with the Floyd. Pete Walsh, who'd worked with Heatwave.
Greg Walsh.
Greg, who'd worked with Heaven 17, and Pete had also worked with Simple Minds. So it was an amazing group of engineers to basically make the tea for and learn from.
Yeah, and quite varied as well, like in terms of that's what I love about it, talking to Flood and also to Stephen Street, the range of bands that comes to this place, because obviously pop bands had to go to recording studios, and they were proper bands at the time as well.
Well, it was true. Interestingly, though, Utopia, where Tim and I started, had quite a big name in the kind of sort of jazz funk, early black music, London kind of black music scene, didn't it? Interestingly, so there was quite a bit of Light of the World and
Beggar and Co.
And
that of course led to Spandau Ballet.
Yeah,
I mean the standard of bands, producers, engineers that would work in that place was amazing. Now looking back on it, I mean a perfect example was as an assistant I got to work with Rod Temperton on a Heatwave album.
Right.
And that's a pretty special opportunity to be able to watch Rod Temperton do a vocal arrangement and be in charge of the tape machine. And he trusted me enough to request me on sessions, and I would have to drop in on little phrases here and there. Of course, an art that's no longer required, but it was an art, wasn't it? I mean, when you work the tape machine, if you gave the producer confidence, and he could actually turn to you and say, "I need you to go in at bar 22, halfway through that vocal phrase, and get out."
Exactly.
You could be on that gig for quite a while because they didn't have to worry about it. So it is a lost art, but there was definitely an element of danger and fear, wasn't there?
Yeah, there really was, and particularly if you messed it up as well. There was definitely danger and fear then.
This is something that we've heard quite a lot of, the changing kind of atmosphere in the studios, where it used to be this kind of hierarchic thing, and the quite often there were certain producers or people higher up the ladder who would be rather not particularly nice to tape ops.
100%.
Yeah, and that seems to have changed a bit.
I'd say
now.
so. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, the studio etiquette.
Yeah.
Of you keep your fucking mouth shut basically, and don't speak unless you're spoken to, was very clearly marked out. And I know for one, I broke that and got myself into a lot of hot water. Even on the Dire Straits album, it was funny because when I spoke out, it was just out of total enthusiasm to what was going on. And Neil Dorsman was running the machine, and Mark Knopfler was there. And when he'd play something, I'd say, "No, you don't want to throw that one away. That one was the best one. Check that one again." Yeah. And it was born of just like trying to be really helpful. But they didn't. They took me aside, and Neil Dorsman said, "Look," and Mark said, "Look, we really appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're going to have to keep your mouth shut unless we ask you to." And I was so embarrassed that I realised that I was basically getting a bit too much. And I learned a lesson, but I did keep. But the great thing about that was that Mark would after that would play, and I would stumm working the tape machine, and they would talk about it for a while, and occasionally they'd say, "What did you think?" And they were really nice about it, and it was. So doing that record was ultimately a positive thing, but I had to be told to shut up on a couple of occasions.
This is complete digression, but just really quickly, when I was working at Shepherd's Bush Empire, the Pretenders played a gig, and they played 2 nights, and I had nothing to do during the sound check, so I sat in the audience, a deserted audience, just watching the sound check, and I was there for about half a song, and then someone came scuttling up to me and said, "You shouldn't be here. If Chrissy sees you, she'll point at you and tell you to fuck off. I would leave now if I were you. No one's in the sound check." I went, "Okay," and I walked out. Anyway, contrast that with the Stones playing a secret gig a couple of weeks later. And the sound check was like everyone was in the room. The bar staff were in the room.
Of course.
We were all in the room. And not only that, they were asking, Mick Jagger was asking us what we thought. "What do you think? Does it sound all right out there? What do you think of the bloke, top bar out there?"
It's a pretty good impression.
Yeah.
I tell you, a very similar thing happened much later on in my career when I was working with Robert Plant on Now and Zen in about 1988. The word got out that Jimmy Page was coming in to play guitar solo, and usually in the studio it'd be like, where is that guy that's helping us with setting up and making where is he? I can't find him. Can we get a tech in here? Where's the tech? Never anyone around. And then suddenly that day, I remember walking into the studio and there's like 2 guys with screwdrivers at the back just re-putting in some of the output.
Yes.
That's strange. And then there were 2 assistants that day, and everyone wanted to be in the room to see Jimmy
Classic.
play. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. And did he show up?
Oh yeah, he did, and he played. Yeah, it was pretty special.
Right.
Because I think it was the first time he played on a Robert Plant recording, or them together. Since Zeppelin, so it was pretty special. But going back to the Utopia days. I mean, the reason that I got my first opportunity to sort of move up was sort of based upon other people's laziness in a way, because Chris and I were both put on an album for a band in the 80s called Kajagoogoo. I was the assistant and Chris was helping me. And basically the producer was a guy called Colin Thurston, who was a very successful producer at the time. He'd worked with Duran Duran, and he was co-producing with Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran. But they obviously were there fully present during the day. But when it got to about 6 or 7, Nick had an American girlfriend. She'd always want him to go out to dinner, and Colin would go. So they would basically leave and say, you know, you're in good hands with Tim and Chris, right? So I sort of stepped up into the engineering chair, and Chris moved over and he ran the tape machines for me. So this was a great opportunity, and we were up till late recording guitars or mainly keyboards plugged in, I would guess. But Colin and Nick would come in the next morning and say, you know, that's great, no problem. So we made the whole record like that. And when it came to the labels and then saying, we need a couple of B-sides, because we've got the singles now, but we need the B-sides. They didn't want to have anything to do with that, so they said, you could do that at the weekends.
Right.
So I was given the chance to engineer the B-sides completely on my own without them even being around. And I took that opportunity and asked the band for the demos, and went back and wrote some notes and ideas that I thought we could try. And we cut these 2 little B-sides, and they came out pretty well. And I had contributed, so I thought, I've got nothing to lose, I'll just be brave. So I went up to the band and said, look, you know, I know I'm going to get an engineering credit, but I feel like I've sort of helped a little bit with the production, and I would really love it if I could possibly get a co-production credit. If that's not cool, then fair enough, but at least I'm going to ask. And they were like, that's absolutely fine, absolutely well deserved. You know? So I'd started the album as the tape op, ended up co-producing 2 B-sides, but the label loved them and put one of them as the title track of the album. Right. So I went from being the assistant to producing one, I think it was actually 2 songs on the album, and I ended up, the record went gold, and I got my first gold disc as a record producer. And that was age 21 or 22.
So in the days before Wikipedia, because now you can, you know, check credits pretty much, how would a record company have found, because presumably that would have made a difference going forward, you know, for you to be able to say, I've done production on these, so now I'm qualified.
That was about the time, actually, with the rise of the independent producer-manager.
Chris is absolutely right, because I don't think, actually, looking back at it, it made that much difference at all.
Right.
Because I was still employed by Utopia Studios, and Chris is exactly right. This was the time that people were starting to get managers to be able to promote what they did, because at that time I carried on at Utopia, and you know, there's a lot of luck and being in the right place at the right time. I'm the first to admit that, and I was one of those people who had a good amount of luck. And the perfect example being this, you know, the studio manager says, you're on session Monday, remix room, doing some mixing, and I said, okay, great. And I said, who is it? And they said, it's a new band called Cutting Crew. They're signed to Siren. And I was like, okay, great. And I worked on a song for like a day and a half, maybe 2 days, and it was I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight, which I got the mix credit for. Right. And which, you know, was the #1 song. And that was purely because artists, as we said, were booking studios because of the quality of the staff. They didn't bring in their own engineer then. They just trusted who was put on the session, and that person that was put on the session was me.
But it could have been anything. It could have been something else entirely. You know, it so happened that it was that song.
Exactly.
And that became such a massive song. So would you get like I mean, in terms of financial, would you get a bonus if you got?
No. You were on a regular fee, in the same way George Martin was when he worked for EMI and did the Beatles.
Yes.
You know, the only extra money we got is if we went over 6 o'clock and we get a bit of overtime. You know.
And same period of time, the quality of artists. There were demos. We had a demo room as well. I don't know whether this was before Cutting Crew or after, but it's definitely that period. One of our engineers was doing the demos for Sting, and he was about to cut all the songs that he had ready for Synchronicity, and he was in there every day on his own with an engineer. And one day the engineer called in and said that his kitchen had been flooded. And he was waiting for a plumber to come out. And Annie, the studio lady who looked after the booking, said, "Do you think you can handle it, Studio 2?" And I said, "Sure, definitely can handle it." She said, "Because it's Sting." And I said, "That's fine." So I did one of the demos. I did Tea in the Sahara.
Oh, really?
Still got it at home. And I spent a couple of days, or it was a day, with Sting recording that. But I mean, those sort of opportunities don't happen anymore.
Sure. No.
Even if, can you imagine?
No,
I just got called to do this thing.
Yeah.
So that was a great opportunity.
So was that just him playing everything before?
Yeah.
So the other two.
Yeah, it was him playing everything. And in fact, what's interesting about that was I remember hearing the other demos.
Yeah.
And on Every Breath You Take.
Yeah.
It was his vocal, wasn't it? And a keyboard pad.
It's a keyboard.
The guitar wasn't. The guitar part hadn't been written.
Sure.
Which became such an important part of that song.
It was a really basic DMX Oberheim setup. It was a really basic drum machine pattern.
Yeah.
And the keyboard just playing the chords.
Yeah.
Every Breath You Take. One vocal and maybe a back vocal and a little bit of bass guitar.
Yes.
And that was it.
So what was the thing that kind of... When did Utopia finish?
Chris and I worked on a Dead or Alive album.
Oh, yeah.
And that's when we started to work. I started to become the engineer for a German producer called Zeus Beheld. And he produced the Fashion album.
Oh, okay.
The band from Birmingham, which is how I met him first, because I was assisting on the Fashion album.
Yeah.
And then he got on well with me and asked me to be his engineer. So for him, I did John Fox album, mixed that, a band called This Island Earth, and then the Dead or Alive record, which was quite an experience, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. It was an entertaining time.
And that was while Wayne Hussey was still in it?
Correct.
Okay.
Which is there you can see the connection.
The connection,
How I ended up working with a mission.
So that wouldn't have been Youthquake then?
No, it was the one. It was the album directly before they worked with Stock Aitken and Waterman.
Yeah.
And Pete still looked vaguely masculine at the time.
Yeah.
He was a great singer, actually, for what he was. He was the loudest
Powerful.
singer I've ever heard.
Oh, right.
We used to say, you know what we used to do? We used to set up a microphone really close to him, but then have another one that he didn't know about, which is a few feet away.
And use that.
He literally, whatever close mic I set up, he'd fucking smash it. So we put a microphone, a hidden microphone, and we would use that, right? And which is why it has a slightly ambient tone, that album. And Pete's he's a tough fucking guy too. Okay. He would, when you were recording, you'd sit at the console and he would come up behind you if you liked something and just give you a hearty smack across the shoulders. And it was like, thanks Pete, thanks very much, mate.
You have to be able to take a punch to work with Dead or Alive.
Oh my god, wow, okay. So that was... And then Wayne Hussey left after that, right?
Yeah, Wayne didn't really ever fit in, did he?
Okay.
He contributed some really cool guitar parts to what he was playing on, but he would do his own. At the end of the sessions, he would go off on his own.
Yeah.
And in fact, I went out with him on a couple of nights. That's how we got to know. But the others had their own thing. That's for sure.
Right.
But it was that was the period where Zeus had an independent manager called Sandy Robertson and Paul Brown from World's End Management.
Yeah.
And I met them by assisting or engineering for Zeus.
Yeah.
And that's how I ended up getting my first management.
Right, okay.
So that was the beginning of...
Did you have management before you left Utopia, or did it happen?
No. It happened just around that time, that was, when you... The premise of your podcast, when you feel that... Was that the moment when you feel I can do this?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I'd definitely say that around that period was when I thought I can do this.
Okay.
Because I'd worked with the Dead or Alive, I'd had the Catchy, I'd worked with the Cutting Crew, and I thought I had it. And what happened was because I'd worked with a lot of sort of fairly contemporary sounding things, it was just completely coincidental. Robert Plant was looking for an engineer who was very up on the new stuff.
Yeah.
Because that's the sort of guy he is. He's not always in the past sticking to what he knows best. He's always reinventing, as you know. He reinvents himself every 5 minutes. He's always challenging himself. And he thought, well, I don't want to work with one of the old school engineers. I've done that.
Yeah.
I'll work with some new young fella. And luckily for me, he chose me.
Yeah.
We had a conversation on the phone, and the next thing I knew, I was at Marcus Studios with like a 6-piece band who all needed their own separate headphone balances, and I was working on a Harrison board in a studio I'd never worked in, and it was at that point I realised I wasn't actually, didn't really have it down at all. And really, I think if I'm really honest with myself, I still don't think I have it completely down. I think that's one of the things about what we do is that you always sort of think, I wonder whether I'm going to get through this one. I don't think this. I think if you get to that point, I think you should probably retire anyway.
Sure.
I have continual moments where I'll be doing something, so I think, I
wonder whether, if you'd gone through the traditional schooling the way that they do now, whether we wouldn't have had so much of that, because we learn from watching others. And I think sometimes we might have missed some of the things.
Well,
maybe.
possibly, but I think that also we learn so much by feeding off each other as young assistants that we'd suddenly go, oh, I tried doing this. Oh, did you? And again, that was the lucky thing about having these studios where we grew up, so to speak, together, that you had this, we could feed off each other all the time. Like somebody would suddenly be working with somebody who'd say, oh, you know what they did was blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Like the first time, do you remember the engineer who trained us? This is long before the days of sampling and being able to replace a drum sound, for instance. The engineer would take the snare drum sound, feed it through a loudspeaker, put a snare drum on top of it in the live room, and so the snare drum would be banging out of the speaker, hitting the snare drum, which he would then re-record. So you would have a sort of a fresh sounding snare, which he could then feed in.
Mix with what they
mix with the original. So it was a very early sort of form of sort of replacing.
Yes.
We called it Boris the Snare.
Boris the Snare, which used to sit.
I've never heard of that being done. I've heard that being done with a kick drum.
Well, people would still do it.
Yeah, I've heard other people, separate from.
I don't think it was unique to John Maxwell who did it, but those things, and then Tim would go, "Oh my God, have you seen what John's doing?" And then
Well, I think that was also the beauty of seeing producers come in and watching the way that they handled a session.
Yeah.
Being in that position of being the fly on the wall.
Sure.
Not only did you learn what was right, you learned what was wrong.
Yeah.
So many times you'd watch a producer talking to an artist, and you'd see the effect that had on the artist, and realise, this guy, why would he have done that?
Right.
Why did he say that? That was a terrible thing. This guy's got no confidence. I mean, I've seen people walk out of studios just they've lost it,
Right.
And you sort of learned the good and the bad, didn't you, from watching other people. But another thing that this engineer showed Chris and I was this art that once again is no longer relevant, because with cut and paste, you find something you like in a session, Apple C, paste it down there, Apple V.
Yeah.
You don't even have to think about it. But back then, it wasn't so simple. So if somebody sung the backing vocals particularly well in the first chorus, and the subsequent choruses had gone downhill, he was able to make a balance of the backing vocals onto a separate half-inch or quarter-inch machine of just the backing vocals. And then by finding out the time it took by tapping the machine and hitting play, he could then move those vocals into the next choruses manually.
Yeah.
It was called spinning in.
Right.
So you'd work out the timing, practice a couple of times, then play the multi-track, and then 1, 2, hit the button. Then they come in and they're in. And they're perfect, and you could move them. That's something that we take for a given now. But that was an art in itself, wasn't it?
Yeah, we did. I mean, I did that a lot.
I know. It was an amazing trick, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And in fact, going back to how we got into that with the Robert Plant situation, he didn't know that. So my name to this day for Robert is Spinning Tim. He always says, Spinning Tim, because I was able to, he would do something, and I'd say, don't worry, I'll just put it over here. And he said, well, you can't do that. And I said, oh yes, I can.
Right.
And he'd never seen that, which is quite surprising, really. But obviously, Johnny Mac was doing it probably more than others. But these are these are talents that we have that are no longer required.
Yeah.
Surplus to requirement.
You were at Marcus Studios doing the Robert Plant album. How was it? How did that session go? You're saying you thought you were super confident.
Yeah, it was a good lesson, because the thing is that the 80s, and if you remember those sessions, a lot of what we did was plug things out the back of Linn drums, Oberheim systems, DMX, maybe a vocal. I mean, they were very separated. That was the 80s sound, wasn't it? And there wasn't too many traditional band setups coming through. Mixing is one thing, but actually being able to cut a band and do that is something else completely. And I wasn't prepared for that at all. So yes, I was struggling, and it was clear that I was struggling.
Right.
Luckily for me, Robert and I got on well,
Yeah.
and he liked my, I guess, enthusiasm or whatever it is, but he was complaining at the studio for the studio not being right, and he kept going up to the owner of Marcus and saying, "What the fuck's wrong with that console? We can't get the headphone balances right." And Marcus said, "It's that guy in there doesn't know what the fuck he's doing." And luckily for me, Robert,
Stuck by you.
He stuck by me, and I got it together eventually. And I also was working with another Robert's co-producer was a guy called Benji Lefebvre, who did the live sound. So he was also able to help, and between us we got it all figured, and we made it through. But it was touch and go for me there. I definitely could have been kicked out to the curb.
Right.
If But another funny thing, coming up through the days of punk, when we were at school, if you were the sort of person who would join the chess club or the debating club or really concentrate on your homework, you'd probably be listening to Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin. The more rebellious gang, we were listening to The Damned or The Clash, and that was our scene, right?
Yeah.
So I was always like, songs are all the same, more like, I was part of that crew. And so here I am in the studio working with Robert Plant, and I really didn't know Led Zeppelin
right
well. I'd heard songs, but it wasn't my thing. And as you know, as soon as you start a job in a studio, you don't have time to listen to music anyway. You're in the studio all day.
Yeah.
So you sort of, in a way, you stop listening deeply when you get your first job because you're too busy.
Yeah.
So I wasn't that familiar, and Robert would, when we were setting up the drum sound, would start referencing tracks.
Yeah.
Have you heard Misty Mountain Hop? And I was thinking like, I said, I don't think I know that one. I know that one. What about When the Levee Breaks? No, not that one either. I've heard, and you go, and then it was a very uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah.
But he was fine. He said, well, what give me an example of a good drum sound then. And I said, what about New Rose? And Robert said, I love that. And he loved The Damned too, right?
Yeah.
And the next day, and this is, I swear it's true, he walked in and it was still albums then, not CDs. Yeah. He brought a pile of Led Zeppelin albums, the whole lot. He put it on the console and he said, Spinning Tim, check my old band out, I think you'll like them. Right? And that's how I got all my Led Zeppelin albums.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
I know. It's amazing, really.
Yes.
So funny.
But I guess that a lot of those people wanted that kind of. I mean, I was thinking different decade, but Lindsey Buckingham, when they were doing Tusk, he wanted all the punk stuff. He didn't want anything to do with the kind of dinosaurs, as he kind of.
So he wanted to change from Rumours to.
Yeah, definitely. And he was referencing the Clash like mad, and he was referencing.
Was he? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I didn't know that either.
For Tusk, and he was wanting a cut.
It didn't work, did it then?
But having said that, I mean, the actual track Tusk itself, it's an odd fucking track.
It is, yeah.
You know what I mean? It's definitely, it's no sort of, go your own way or whatever it's called again.
Sure. No,
it's pretty mad. So he obviously wanted to change things.
Yes. Which I guess that brings us on in a way to after Robert Plant. Shortly after that, am I right in saying, was Tin Machine? Maybe a year or so after that.
Yeah, pretty close to that at least.
Because Bowie was someone who I really admired for throwing himself into this kind of edgy, punky band situation. Because I spent the whole of the 80s, I mean, I was quite young anyway, but I liked the occasional song of his, but I didn't really get what all the fuss was about. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly I was reading in Melody Maker that he'd joined a band, or he'd formed a band. And I just thought this was unimaginably cool. I just thought, like, that's the perfect thing for someone like him to do. And then also I liked the album as well, which helped. So, but I just thought that was a really, really smart thing to do on his part.
Most people didn't, of course.
Well, it's interesting because I remember reading at the time a lot of good things.
Oh
about
yeah,
it.
right to the very top of it. Yeah,
Right.
it's true. The reviews were positive for the first 20 minutes. They really were.
Okay, yeah.
Even
and then
Q magazine did Ready to Rock.
Yeah, that's
David
right. I
Bowie
remember that.
right back on track with Tin Machine and all that.
Yeah.
But I mean, what was great about the Robert Plant thing was it wasn't really what I wanted to do, was to make 80s sounding pop records.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I was getting a name for.
Mm.
And what was nice about the Robert Plant situation was finally I could now be maybe accepted by some bands
Yeah.
to record some rock bands, which is what I really wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I did that with bands like The Mission, and that was probably a moment where I thought, okay, I can do this now. Because
I think that was a big turning point for you.
Yeah, it really was.
I really do think, because I remember back when you did it.
Yeah.
And I think there was a sudden surge.
Yeah.
From that record.
Yeah, I mean, because it was a cool band to work with, and we got through it well, and I felt like I had it under control. So when that opened up, the Bowie thing came through the fact that I'd worked with a lot of alternative guitar bands, because I'd worked with The Mish, I'd worked with The House of Love, and Gene Loves Jezebel.
Right.
A lot of guitar bands.
Yeah.
So when David was looking for somebody to work with.
Yeah.
He wanted to make more of a guitar-based record.
Yeah.
And it was actually Reeves who was friends with Billy Duffy. And I'd met the Cult because the Cult were friends with the Mish.
Yeah.
They were very close. Wayne and Ian were close, and Billy. And Reeves said, do you know any young engineers who would be good to work on this record? And Billy Duffy put my name forward. So that's how I got the call. But the interesting thing about the Bowie... I mean, there's lots of interesting things that happened on that record.
Sure.
But I mean, the fact was that when I went into that project, it wasn't Tin Machine.
Okay. Yeah.
I got the phone call and was asked to go and work in Switzerland on David's new album.
Yeah.
And for a fair amount of time, it was the next David Bowie record. And when I heard the music, I was super excited by it for the same reasons, hopefully, that you were. Because the 80s had left me a little cold.
Yeah.
It had started to become very formulaic and 80s sounding and polished, and I think David was definitely a little bit sick of trying to be a pop star, and he lost a lot of the creativity. And
that's interesting, Tim. I didn't know that. So when you started the record, the band as such, it wasn't Tin Machine.
Correct. Yeah.
Which makes you wonder if it had never been Tin Machine, but had been David Bowie album.
What it would have been
how it would have been received.
I know, I've often thought about it. But yeah, we went. So I flew to Switzerland, and the only person that was there at that point was Reeves.
Right.
And we carried on working on these demos at Mountain Studios, and it was Reeves, myself, and David every day. And then David said, "I've got a great idea for the rhythm section," and he suggested that he would bring in Hunt and Tony from Iggy's band, And I'd never met them before, but once they came into the session, the dynamic changed very quickly.
Right.
Because they were big personalities.
Formidable characters.
Very funny, very loud.
Yeah.
And they didn't take direction particularly easily.
Right.
And David, of course, being the sort of person that he is, what's made him so special is that when he works with people, he doesn't try and make them play the way he hears it. He lets them express themselves the way that they feel comfortable, which is why his records always sound so different. You know, if you get Reeves Gabrels in, you don't try and get him to play like Carlos Alomar.
Right.
You know, you let him do his thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's what David has done so well is when he changed his sound, he changed his crew, because of course, you know, he doesn't second guess everything that you're playing.
Yeah.
And the same as even being an engineer, I was very nervous, as you can imagine, and I'd sort of set the vocal sound up, and I'd think, okay, I wonder if he's going to be okay with this. How's the headphones? Are you okay with the sound of your voice? He's like, are you okay? Are you fine with it? Yeah, I'm fine. Headphones are fine. Never a problem. Total professional. But that wasn't his thing. He wasn't really interested in the board.
Okay. Yeah.
He wanted to be surrounded with people that were making it fun and a creative situation. Anyway, so Hunt and Tony, David loved the fact that the sessions became a bit chaotic.
Yeah.
It was hell for me.
Right. A bit spiky, I can imagine.
It was hell for me because they didn't want to... Hunt was the sort of guy who would be like, he wouldn't want to spend half a day getting a sound together.
Yeah.
It was like, right, come on, let's do one.
Yeah.
And I'm like, still EQing.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the songs on the Tin Machine 1, there's a couple where you can hear me dialing in the EQ.
Oh, yeah.
Because they just used the first take, that was it.
Yeah, yeah.
They didn't want to do it. And Hunt, as he was playing it with his headphones, if he wanted to hear the toms louder and his cans as he's playing, rather than stop and at the end of the take say, can I have some more toms in my headphones?
Yeah.
He would grab the mics as he was playing and pull them down closer to the toms. He literally would do that. He's like, he just puts the stick down and you'd see him pull this down like that and he'd carry on playing. I mean, there were missing beats and, you know, a chorus section would hit and he would be one bar late and this right cymbal would start one bar after the chorus because he'd hear it and go, oh, it's the chorus.
I mean, one of the things I really like about it is it's a little bit scrappy.
It is, but that's what they were.
Well,
right?
true. I mean, especially in the
Bowie
drums.
albums are like that.
True.
I mean, I remember listening to Lodger with you, Tim, years ago, and there's tracks where and I think it's Carlos Alomar playing where he's messed up and it's like he's hit a wrong string or something.
You can hear him
but
flipping
fuck
the
it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
That's what makes Bowie records so great.
Absolutely, and that's where I learned, I think, so much from being on that session from David about leave it alone, you know.
Sure.
But the sessions were definitely chaotic, and then because the band had such a big part of the sound, when we got to Compass Point, I always remember the day David came in and said, I don't think this is going to be a David Bowie record.
Right.
I'm going to call it Tin Machine. And I can imagine thinking, oh dear. Well, that's
in your career,
that's a shame. That's a shame. But it was great.
How did the rest of them react? Were they all?
Well, they liked it because it was their band.
Yeah.
But I don't think people ever took the idea that David Bowie's just one of the guys.
Yeah, it's
it doesn't fly, does it? Really?
It's so bizarre because it totally flew with me. That's the thing. I mean, that's what got me into Bowie. Funnily enough, it was my entry point to him. You know,
that's great. I mean, there's two sides to that first album. The first half is when it was recorded in the casino, because Mountain Studios had tie lines through to a casino.
Okay.
Right, so the band would set up in the casino.
Yeah.
And I put microphones all the way around the top of the casino.
Yeah.
So what seems like reverb, it is reverb, but it's natural reverb.
Okay.
It's the sound of the casino. So that's why Heaven's in Here, when he starts on that first drum fill, you feel the sound of the casino. Yeah. And other songs, like Crack City and I Can't Read, they are very closed in. Because when we reached Compass Point and then we were recording more songs, that was a dead room, essentially. Right. And Status Quo were recording the album with the song I'm in the Army Now on it. You know, I don't know what album that was on, but they were in the next room and they were hilarious. But they were always sort of, you come out and they'd be looking around the corner to see David. But they were brilliant guys, but they'd arrived 2 weeks before us. And the studio by this point was in a little bit of disarray in Compass Point, and they'd nabbed all the good mics, right? And they'd also nabbed, more importantly, all the mic stands, right? So we were cutting tracks and I'd say to the studio in it, we need some more mic stands in here. And they said, oh, well, we'll get some shipped in from the mainland, you know, and that could take a week. And you don't tell Hunt that he has to wait for anything. Right? He wanted to play right now. So I actually got string and I hung microphones from the roof on pieces of string as overheads. And it worked pretty well, actually, but they were just literally hanging down. He sort of tack up a bit of string onto the roof, and it was a make-do, but it was...
I remember doing an album much later in Australia, about 10 odd years ago, something like that, and we did the same thing. The studio didn't have enough mic stands, so I just made them out of wood.
You probably could make them out of wood, I couldn't do it.
Just because that's what... Then we were waiting for new ones to turn up, but they worked okay, so we just left them. It was just using what you could find.
But it was pretty mind-blowing for me at 26 to be in a studio, and like when we get to New York, I think Chris actually came down and visited because you were over doing something and you came to the studio at Right Track.
Yeah.
But being in Right Track Studios mixing with David and and David's friends would pop by. Okay. So, you could be mixing and look around and there's Brian Eno and they're chatting away, and then another day Yoko stopped by and Yoko would come by quite often, and then Jim's coming in later and Jim, and then of course Iggy, so Iggy's in there, and it was just, for me, it was just absolutely mind-blowing. And I was very fortunate.
So did things change considerably for you after that as a result of doing Tin Machine, or was it just part of the general sort of flow of
I think when you work with a Robert Plant or a David Bowie, I think what it does do is it gives you credibility with a lot of sort of the labels that you can handle someone of that level.
Right.
I remember when I met Sharon Osbourne when I was working with Ozzy, and she said, she thought I'd be able to handle it because I've worked with Bono and and all things like that. And if you can handle those sort of musicians, you should be able to do that.
Yeah.
So it gave you, but I mean, I find, and I think Chris would agree, that no matter what record you do, you're as good as your last record. I mean, it doesn't give you any guaranteed anything. No, nothing does.
No.
Do you think, Tim? Obviously, this, and you're well known for it. The sort of guitar-based music, to use a most generic term. But do you ever try and do something completely different to make a change? So once you've been known for sort of Robert Plant and Bowie, did you ever think, I'm going to try and do something almost radically different?
I think what I did do, and I'm happy that I did do, was not get caught up sort of replicating the same projects over and over again. I made a really, really conscious effort to, I'll do a Sepultura album and then I'll work with Tears for Fears.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. Obviously, there were certain points that you can't go beyond.
Yeah.
But I always tried to sort of work with different styles of music. And quite often, you learned something from one artist who was in one direction that you could really bring to the table to another artist who was completely different. And surprisingly, like, when I was asked to work with Tears for Fears, when I talked to Roland, he said, I love Tin Machine. So, you sort of think by doing this record, it's going to bring you this.
Yeah.
But actually it brings you something completely different together.
Totally.
And when I worked with Porcupine Tree, and I could hear it in the music, I said, are you a big Tears for Fears fan? And he said, absolutely. I love Elemental, which is an album I did with Tears for Fears. So I think, if you get caught into the same area and you always make grunge records or you always make, pop records, I would find that so tedious.
Yeah.
So I did definitely make an effort to try and mix it up.
Yeah.
And I think it helped. I think it gives you a bit more longevity. I mean, recently I've been mixing quite a lot of jazz records, which I've really enjoyed because that's a whole other art altogether.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I did anything. I mean, changing up the technologies. I mean, a big thing for all of us was half of my. I mean, I think it's probably been 37 years in this business now. Half of it was made with analog recording.
Yeah.
And the other half was with the new world of Pro Tools. So that was not something I chose, but I certainly bloody had to make sure I got my head around it because I wouldn't have had a job anymore.
Did you learn it on the job, or did you sort of have a moment where you thought, right, I'm going to spend a month learning Pro Tools?
I'll tell you exactly what happened. I was doing Tears for Fears in LA. Some guy says, do you want to go over to Westlake to see this new Sonic Solutions or whatever it was then? And I walked in with Mark O'Donoghue, who was my engineer at the time, and this guy gave us a demo, and I was like, nah, not for me. Don't really like it. Don't really want to see the audio. Why would I want to see the audio? I don't really want to see that. So I said, thanks very much, and left. And then it was only as you carried on working in it, it would be appearing here and appearing here. I suddenly thought, shit, if I don't try and get my head around this, I'm going to be over. So I eventually, and it was expensive back then as well. I remember I took a loan out and bought a Pro Tools rig and had it set up in the dining room. And a guy came over and gave me a few lessons. And then the first record I did on it was a Goldfinger record. And the guy who was in the band was a producer called John Feldman, who he was the singer of the band. He's a very successful producer now, but he was really into it. So I would sort of be like, oh, let's not go too far with this, but he would push the other way. So I learned a lot by working with artists, the younger artists all knew how to do it. The first record I did on my own with the Pro Tools was Ozzy. And it was very useful.
But it is funny how now, sort of younger generation of people coming up and making records who have these kind of rose-tinted specs about the idea of what working on analog is like.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't make me cross. I just find it funny because two things they fail to understand is, one, that's all we had.
Yeah.
It wasn't like we had a choice to go, oh no, we're going to have an analog sound. That's all we had.
Yeah.
So there was if we had the opportunity to work in a different way, we would probably have taken it, but there wasn't one.
Yeah.
And also, they seem to think that the idea of committing something to tape has this sort of ability to make everything sound like the Beatles. There were so many terrible sounding records made on tape in the 1960s and 70s.
Totally.
Really awful.
Yeah.
We definitely romanticize about those days.
Right.
And as Chris says, it wasn't a choice.
Sure.
That's the thing. Is now you can make a decision if you want the vocals to be smashed and overly compressed and add tape simulation. You can make it pretty fucking close, close enough. But in those days, if you wanted something to sound the way it did when you were setting up the sound, when you played it back off the tape the first time, most of the time we'd go, remember? You'd set a drum sound up in it, you'd go, that's killer. Put it onto the tape when you hit the playback.
Right.
You didn't immediately go, now it sounds good.
Right,
You'd usually be quite disappointed.
Yeah, you just do go, I'll step a
Lost
little bit more top end.
Exactly.
Straight away.
Yeah.
But the one thing that amazes me, though, I mean, I started recording at the very end of analog, so I got a couple of years of it, and then it all went digital. But reading stories about the tape days is how you guys seem to find ways of doing, a bit like the spinning it in thing, find ways of doing stuff that is now second nature on Pro Tools. So you would,
well, we had to be more creative.
You have to be more creative, but you were almost preempting the desires to have that flexibility even back then. Like I was amazed to discover that the Beatles were already doing bouncing down.
Yeah, and committing the effects.
Yeah. Like I that was quite a surprise to me. Oh wow, they were already doing that then. Of course.
Well, you had to because
you had to.
Yeah, because you kept wanting to add more stuff.
Yeah.
The only way of doing that is to submix, but you had to make the decision.
And that's that making the decision, because that's what it is. It's all about making a decision. You can do that now. You can make a decision and you just hide it, but people don't.
Yeah.
And that's why the role of the mixing engineer has changed so dramatically.
Right.
Is that people in the recording don't make any decisions and quite often don't have any fucking idea of what they want to do.
No.
So they just print it all for you and say, you figure it out.
Fix it in the mix.
So in the old days, if you were mixing something, you were working on this premise, right?
Yeah.
Here's a band, they've made a record with a renowned producer. They've spent a lot of time in good studios with good microphones, good players, making decisions about sounds, right?
Yeah.
And when you got to mix it, you were sort of trying to stay true to what they were doing. You'd be like, careful,
Yeah.
You don't go, you're not going in making huge decisions like, well, they've recorded 6 parts here because they can't make their fucking mind up.
Right.
Or they've used 6 mics and they want you to choose yours. You were staying true to what they did and making a really good balance. But that's not what mixing is now. Very rarely do I get anything where I push the pedals up and just go, wow.
But that's also a changing style of production. I mean, to me, this idea of just throwing the kitchen sink at it and let somebody else figure out, that's not production.
No, it's not.
No.
Production is and taking the song and enhancing it to the best that song can possibly be, and making decisions so that the mixing side of it is just it's almost like that was nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember somebody telling me that when I know it's a bit persona non grata now, but when Mike Leander used to make the Gary Glitter records, who was a great string arranger, a great producer, whatever we think of him now, but Mike Leander was a very talented man. And by all accounts, by the time the Glitter band had finished playing and he'd done it, the mix was nothing. He was just like, well, that's it, just put a fade on it. Because it's done.
Yeah.
It's so funny, isn't it? Because you did that and then the mixing was fine and that's the way it was. Then we went to the next era where people couldn't make their mind up.
Yeah.
So when you heard a mix of something, it would literally you'd blow your mind. You go, I can't believe we sent you this, but you've given us this.
Yes.
Right? And then when Pro Tools gave producers like us the ability to make even more commitment. So like now sometimes when I'm producing something, I'll have the delays going, I'll have the levels being pushed in the chorus, I'll clean the toms, I'll do everything I want. So the mixing again has gone back to not being anything.
Right.
But the labels can't understand it anymore now. So they hear the mix and they say, well, it doesn't sound any different to what you recorded. And you think, well, that's because I've done it properly. I've actually made those decisions already. So you almost have to send them something terrible and then send them something proper because they can't get their heads around that idea anymore.
Do you think it could also be because, depending on which generation the producers come from? So, for example, Flood, when we were recording with Flood, I don't remember the mixing process being a thing at all. It was...
Well, it became a thing later, didn't it, mixing?
But we sort of got to the end of, I mean, this was 2 years ago, we got to the end of, say, a certain track, and I don't think anyone ever said, right, so let's mix it, because it was already mixed, just because of the way Flood had
But that's
gone
because
about.
he's a talented guy who's got a vision for the whole thing.
I love that interview with Flood. I found it really interesting. It is a very similar sort of way he came up,
absolutely.
The way he learned. But the whole idea of a separate mixer didn't come until I remember Tom Lord Alge mixing Stevie Winwood, and that's when it became a separate thing.
Separate job.
The mixer was somebody who was brought in to sort of bring a fresh perspective at the end. Before that, the mixing was part of the engineer and the producer's job during the making of the record.
So I was going to ask you,
became a separate job.
Fresh perspective. Do you think that is the chief reason why a producer will think, I'm going to get someone else to mix this? Because that's the other thing I always find a bit weird, that a producer would want to sort of take his hands off the steering wheel at the end.
Well, I think now it's different because I think a lot of these producers can't mix it anymore. I mean, we did it, that's what we did, right?
Right.
And at first the idea of a separate mixer made no sense.
Yeah.
So, well, I can do that.
Yeah.
But now, I think a lot of people, it's sort of almost become a whole different thing. So you're either a mixer or you can be a producer. It doesn't mean that you can do both anymore. Mixing now is not mixing anymore. It's additional production.
Right.
I mean, I even ask for that credit most of the time because I don't think there's more than, unless I'm mixing for someone like Larry Klein on some of the jazz things I do, 99% of the time I'll be like, okay, well, it'd be really nice if that guitar part in the second half of the chorus had the octave above. I'll just pop that on there.
Oh, yeah.
And then maybe a little bit of percussion here, or I'll try a little keyboard to double that line, because it'd be nice if that vocal was doubled with the keyboard.
Yeah.
And you add that last piece. And a lot of that, sadly, for the artist is because there's no money to make records anymore.
Yeah.
So they would probably have done that given the time.
Yeah.
And given and they also can't afford to work with a producer who can help them.
Yeah.
So now the mixer's job is to sort of finish the job in a way.
Yeah.
It's like, look, you've done this is great, but I'll try and take it to the next level for you. And if they don't like what you add, you can always mute it, so it's not a problem. But they like the fact that you're going the extra mile for them.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, how it's become.
I heard Chris told me the story about you adding shaker to a record and for Daniel.
Oh yeah.
I like that one.
Well, that's funny because carrying on with that whole thing, there you got a situation where you have U2, the biggest band in the world at that time, I guess, and some of the songs I was mixing, I remember when I mixed the song Stuck in a Moment, which I did play shaker and stuff like that on, they decided, because it was a vibe, to have the drum sound on one microphone, well, bounce down to a mono microphone.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but with today's technology, why not just print a few other mics anyway and hide them, right? Because when it came to the mix, it was like really challenging, and I didn't like necessarily. I liked the vibe of it, but I needed more, so I fired my own samples from the loop, and then put shakers on it and tambourines, and then and this is all mixing.
Sure.
But I don't understand why people nowadays can't use that technology. Sometimes wisely, be creative, commit to ideas, but just in case something is not right later, just hide it.
Yeah.
Just have the files there. That the first time that I heard of the idea of a mixer was when it was Tom Lord Alge, and he was the go-to guy, wasn't he? He was the one really who established the mixer mold. And it was at the end of the Robert Plant album, Now and Zen, and Rob Dickens had said, the record company guy said, we need Tom Lord Alge to mix the single, which I was very upset about because I was still in the old school ways of, the producer and the engineer did it.
Yeah.
So Bill Kerbesley didn't want to spend the money, as always, and he said, why does he want someone else to do it? And I said, well, it was for the album. We didn't really mix it as a single. He said, well, can't you do it then? And, you know, you don't argue with Bill if you know Bill Kerbishley. And so I said, Bill, yeah, I can mix it. He said, well, do it the weekend and let's just get it done. So I said, all right. So I went in on the Sunday, mixed the song, tried to make it more like a single, and in the way I approached it. And he sent it off to the label and wrote Tom Lord-Alge's mix, right? And of course they all loved it, and it came out. And my credit on it says mixed by Tim Lord Palmer.
Right, nice.
which sort of says a lot about people in record companies, but there we could go on forever about
that. Yeah. One thing we've talked about quite a lot is with this podcast is people management as well, like particularly with bands. So chemistry. I mean, I love the topic of chemistry in bands. I think it's absolutely classic. I mean, how have you sort of had? Do you think that's still very important to a producer's job, riding the kind of egos, I suppose, within the band? Because that seems to be talking about Flood, that seems to be one of his specialities. He loves that kind of thing, you know, kind of making this member feel, you know, valuable, and maybe taking this member down a peg to try and
management,
even it out. Yeah,
I think it's massive, don't you? I think it's always massive. I mean, pre-production is something that is sort of almost gone now, isn't it? Almost. People don't do much of it, but pre-production.
Massive fan of it.
Right. I'm glad to hear. But back in the days when I would produce bands, the pre-production really was your window into seeing how the dynamic worked within the group.
Yeah.
And you'd start to see the drummers, you know, telling somebody what to do, and you'd think, well, is that the right thing to do, or maybe I could use that in another way. You sort of figure out the hierarchy of the group.
Yes.
And your job is to try and navigate to make the best record you possibly can. So if you can figure out the best way to do that, personality-wise, you're winning.
Right.
Sometimes, I think George Martin said it, didn't he? That the best producers, when they have an idea, they make the artist think they thought of it. Sometimes the personalities, when you're faced to make an album, are not going to work between you and that artist.
Yeah.
And it's a case of sometimes being a big boy and saying, I'm out.
And has that happened?
It has happened, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not pleasant, but you can either bite your lip and get through it.
Yeah.
It depends where you are in your career.
Sure.
You know, a lot of the time you bite your lip because you've got to do it. You've got to get through, right? But I know you've had experiences where you haven't got on with people, and I certainly have.
Yeah.
And we've bitten our lip. Other times you can say, I'm out, you know.
Well, I remember having particularly mixing a record once, and it was actually just a one-off single. And I did the mix, I sent it back, and the record company guy said, yeah, great. And then the artists were like, not quite what we want, so I made some changes. Yeah, so to the point where they went in, they said, well, we've nipped in the studio, and we've done a mix that we like, and we'd just like you to copy it. And I said, yeah, you know what? Why am I even here?
Yeah.
This is just ridiculous. It's like, if you employ me to do something, let me do it. If you don't like it, that's fine, but don't keep getting me to change everything to the point where it's just what you want. Do it yourselves.
Yeah.
There's none of my personality left on it.
Totally.
It's never going to end up being...
So I left.
Did you really?
Yeah, I just said, I'm not your guy.
No, sure. And that's usually a suggestion that something else is wrong as well, I think, with the original...
Well, I think also, yes. Well, also, I think you start to question whether or not the band wanted you to do it in the first place, or whether the record
talked into it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of that. It's just like, who actually
Yeah.
wanted me to do this in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, a couple of things I would like to mention. One of them, the concept of success having a negative impact on productions, and whether it's the artist changing their sort of outlook. You know, if you work with an artist again, and you might have been very successful, does it change the dynamic of the working relationship?
Well, it definitely can, yeah. Sometimes I guess it can give the artist the impression that they're unstoppable and start to challenge you rather than... But most of the time I've found if you work with an artist, and I've been very fortunate enough to work with a lot of artists 2 or 3 times, if you have a chemistry with them and you are respectful of the fact that it's their record and that you're helping them make the record they want, it won't have a negative effect, because hopefully in the first place you haven't been the sort of producer who's ignoring them and telling them what to do. I'm sure for some people that is well, we know that's the case. There's a lot of producers that I can think of who've created a band's biggest hit, but they'll never work with the band again.
And create a monster at the same time.
Because it's been such a horrible experience for that artist. You know, that's definitely fairly well documented. But, I mean, being the sort of producer who... I would never say that I walk into a project, I know exactly the sound it's going to be. I'm collaborative. You know? I would, in my dreams, like to think that I joined the band for that period of time. And sometimes it's a lot and sometimes it's a little, but it's definitely a collaboration. And I think that's a good thing, you know. I mean, it's like that's what makes it fun, is when you feel that you're all in it together and you're all aiming for the same goal. I mean, we came up in the 80s, and in those days it was the band and the producer against the label in a way. There was definitely we don't want the label coming down, I'll keep them out. America wasn't like that. America, the label and the producer were often hand in hand.
Right.
And that was something I learned too late, I think, because I never took advantage of that, and I never was friends with any A&R guys, because I wasn't interested. It was only later in my career I realised they weren't all bad guys. But I can remember when we worked on the Mission first album, you know, Wayne, they came down with a photographer and said, we want a picture of you signing the contract, and Wayne said, I'm not doing that. That's naff. That's not what rock and roll legends are made of, doing these sort of signing things and blah blah. And he wouldn't do some picture session, and it was very different, a very very different time. But I think I've been lucky in, you know, being, as I said, a sort of producer that helps people, if I can, attain the goal that they want in the first place. So that hasn't been too much of an issue.
Yes. I love that album, Carved in Sand, the third.
Oh yeah, we did that one together.
Right, because that was one of the first times I saw your name on the production credits when of an album that I really liked, because we were quite Mission fans in those days.
That was a perfect example.
A lot of fun to do.
That was a perfect example of what you're talking about. Is that I'd worked with the Mission on their first record. And I had a great time, and it was successful, and I was pretty sure that it was in the pocket to do the next one. And then John Paul Jones decides he would work with the band, and Wayne loved Led Zeppelin, and the idea of having one of Led Zeppelin produce his next record, he wasn't going to turn that down. So I got the call that, you know, even though you'd made a successful record, you're not doing it, and I was gutted. I was really disappointed, and it wasn't that easy working with JPJ, I guess. I don't know, I wasn't there, but whatever it was, when it came to making Carved in Sand, they said, let's get the team back together and let's go and make a record. And because we knew each other and we were a little bit older, it was easy, and it was a lot of fun, wasn't it? And then, you know, because if you trust someone and respect them, and respect has to be earned, it doesn't come automatically. I think if a lot of producers make that mistake and think, I've done this, so you respect me, but no, you got to show somebody that you know, why you should listen to me, and once you've got that, they will listen to you.
Right.
But and it was funny actually, because I worked with the Mission again a few years ago, and it was working with Wayne as we're much older fellas now. We've both been through a lot, and that was so fun to do.
So I think we're just left with the level 42 question.
What's that one?
Shall I?
You should explain.
Right, but basically, the idea is that level 42, when they were like on their first couple of albums, things were going quite well, selling reasonably, lots of touring, everything was going fine. But then they had a sit down with each other and they thought, right, in order for the band to sort of survive and then jump up to the next level, we really need to write a couple of full-on hit singles deliberately. So they actually deliberately set out to write, I guess, what became Something About You, Lessons in Love, all of those big bangers, and it was a conscious move. And obviously for them it worked really well, because their career jumped up to arena level, and it was all good. And really, what I wanted to ask you is what you thought of the idea of deliberately going for a hit single at the recording and writing stage. You know, have you had those times when
bands have gone, right, we want to make this a hit, so we want to approach. And do you think it works? Do you think it's a good thing to do?
I definitely think it works.
Okay, right.
I mean, if you have a discipline of you're trying to make a hit song, then immediately there's a lot of things that you're not going to do. Right? I mean, it's as simple as that.
Things that you're not going to do.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the date, I mean, obviously this is a different world that we live in now with Spotify and the Generation Z and no genre and nobody listens to radio the way they used to. But when you're talking about with Level 42, there were things that you would and wouldn't do when you were making a single. You're not going to, unless you were a freak of nature like Bohemian Rhapsody, generally speaking, if you're making a 5-minute single, right, it's not going to work.
Right.
So from the very beginning in the arrangement stage, it's like, how can I make this concise? Right? Yeah. So you have the song and it has to feel like it builds to its core. You don't wait too long for a chorus, which is your hook. Simple things like that. Whereas if it's an album track, you'd be like, I love the way it takes like 2.5 minutes. There'll always be examples to prove that you don't need to do that, whether it's Sound and Vision with David Bowie or whatever it is. But the truth is, there is a formula to it, and
Do you think you've ever done this then?
Absolutely. I mean, even right back to the very beginning of my career when we did Only for Love with Lamal. I mean, that was written and produced as a hit song, and luckily it wasn't a huge hit, but it got in the top 20. But we wouldn't have put things on there that would detract from it being played on the radio.
Stymied its chances.
Because I mean, I think having an end goal is important, isn't it? When by the same token, if you're working on an amazing album track and it's just got this cool vibe and somebody comes up with this really fucking quirky fucking keyboard riff, you'd be saying, it's too poppy, I'm out. Let's leave that, that's ruining the vibe, And it's just the opposite side to that.
Or I suppose occasionally that could then become, people could think, actually this is good enough to be a single, like the old sort of B-side that becomes a single thing with
because sometimes you don't try, do you? It just happens organically.
Yes.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. You can sometimes, suddenly a song that you didn't realise was a single is suddenly turning into that shape.
Yes, I always think of All I Want to Do Is Have Some Fun by Sheryl Crow, which she apparently was a B-side. She recorded it like while the studio was being packed down or something.
I wonder about that. I mean, that was part of the Tuesday night music club sessions.
Yes.
My friend Brian McLeod was one of the co-writers on that. We could ask him, but
Bill Bottrell,
yeah.
They're no idiots, that lot.
No.
So you do wonder.
Okay.
Bill's amazing, isn't he? He's one of those people that not many people mention. But I mean, did you know that on the Michael Jackson song, because he recorded a lot with Michael Jackson, the rap section in Black or White? That's Bill.
No.
Yeah, he said they said it, and he just did it while they were out, and he said, I'm a white guy engineer, but I'm going to just put a rap on. And never be in a colour. That's him. That's Bill Bottrell, But I don't know about the Tuesday night. But,
it might be one of those rock.
But there's definitely something that when you try too hard.
Yes.
Well, look at Big Country, who we work with.
Right.
That the track in A Big Country was the last thing they recorded on The Crossing because they needed an extra track, and that was arguably the biggest hit they had.
Yeah.
And it was something that they said, well, we've got this, and bang it down.
But it's the pressure's off, though, isn't it?
The pressure's off.
When we got this, it might not work.
Well, which also means that you can be a bit more poppy or what have you, not worry about it because
And the other side to that is that a lot of times the label would be like, well, we think we've got a pretty great record, but we've got nothing to lose. Let's tell them that we don't think it's there yet and make them write 3 more songs. And then the band feel the pressure of and they really step it up.
Right.
Because they'll start worrying, and then they can often write something pretty special.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, once again, it's one of those things where, depending on the personality types of the people involved and all that. But people like, all those Trevor Horn great productions, I mean, they knew what they were aiming for the charts, and as soon as something feels wrong, you know it. I have no problem with that idea at all.
Right. It's cool. It's interesting how many different answers.
People have completely different. I mean, I'm sort of with you. I think, and with some of the other guys that, and as Stephen Street said actually, he said the track itself really dictates what the production's going to be like.
It does, yeah.
So if somebody comes along and it's like, that's a pop song.
Yeah.
That's a bit. He said when he was doing Girls and Boys, the Blur song.
Love that song.
Yeah, it's amazing. And they just went all out, just like, fuck it, let's just do it.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed that interview with him as well.
It's a great sort of pop song, and why not?
Yeah.
But there are other people, they're like, no way.
Flood.
The idea of making something,
He was always like, I don't give a shit what it's gonna sound like on the radio.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that in. I'm not editing that out, by the way, Tim.
Well,
Your impersonation of Flood.
Why not?
But no, it is. It's interesting. Some people get very upset about the idea of pandering to the man.
I mean, like you said, the production is dictated by the song. If the song's poppy, I mean, and you're automatically going to go down that road, you'd have to be fighting your instincts to turn it into something that it isn't. Sometimes the artist doesn't know that they've got a single anyway.
True.
They fight it. I remember when I was working on the U2 All That You Can't Leave Behind, they were working on the song Beautiful Day, and Bono would be punishing himself every day going, we need more hooks, he needs to have more. And I said to him, but the hook is the guitar riff. It goes, it's a beautiful day, down, down, down. I said, that is a hook. That is a hit. That sounds like a hit to me. It's just got a hit chorus feeling about it. You don't need anything else. But he was going back to the drawing board and changing things for ages before he was finally happy with it. But what is regarded as a good pop song, it doesn't have to be the vocal does this or the keyboard does that. It can come from anywhere. It's just something that's memorable and that strikes a chord, isn't it? And that could be from anywhere.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I think that's it. Tim.
Before we finish, congratulations, Chris. Did I tell you?
Engineered
a Golden Globe winning song.
Well, yes.
Oh yeah, the Rocket Man.
I think it's important.
What song was it?
I think it's important we acknowledge that in here.
Yeah, I don't know.
Congratulations. No, I think you should leave it in.
So, Tim Palmer there. Many thanks for joining us, and if you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to subscribe.